that we have to look at the fact that there are two Americas. There's the people in the street who are largely unspoken for, who you don't see on mainstream TV, and then there's the Congress, the politicians, the corporate-dominated media, and of course the Bush administration and the whole military-industrial complex. They were, of course, either directing the war or complicit with the war, as Congress was when it gave a blank check to Bush. But the fact of the matter is, the people then, and I think except for a short interlude, perhaps during the invasion itself, but that dissipated quickly, were largely skeptical of the war, skeptical about the Bush administration's assertions. And today, as we can see clearly by the polls, the vast majority sentiment now understands fully that they were lied to, that this war was a war of aggression, that it had nothing to do to protect the national interests of the United States. Mr. Hellman and the others who are also egging on a form of aggression against Iran, they agreed with President Bush when he said in his January 2002 State of the Union message that there was an axis of evil in the world, and that was Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And the Bush administration and his camp followers, like Mr. Hellman, intended that...
Go ahead and bring in... not to cut you off, but to bring in Wayne as a journalist. And where do you see the public opinion right now?
Well, I think we have to keep in mind that the public, before this Iraq war, was being misled, not only by the White House and also by the cooked intelligence coming from the CIA.
Oh, wait, you say cooked intelligence.
Well, we now know that, for example, Vice President Dick Cheney made 25 trips, unprecedented trips, for a vice president to the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, basically bird-dogging the analysts on the intelligence that they were coming up with on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which now we know never existed. We also know that some members of the media not only were being fed the information, but were also reinforcing the propaganda by putting it out and coordinating their activities with the White House. Judith Miller, certainly of the New York Times, Bob Woodward with the Washington Post, several people in the media. How do we know who the people were? Well, most of them were called to testify by Special Counsel Patrick Fitzgerald in the case involving the outing of Valerie Plame Wilson by now we know by Vice President Dick Cheney's office in Karl Rove.
Intelligence background and everything, and where you're, because I've read a lot of your reports. They seem to have a legitimacy within the intelligence community, and that seems to be where you're. Well,
I worked for the intelligence community back in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. But yes, I do have a lot of sources in the intelligence community who were then very upset at how the intelligence was being manufactured, how they were told, no, that's not what you're saying, this is what you're saying.
Shape the American people's
exactly, right. And I knew that when I say cooked intelligence, this intelligence, the actual intelligence, was being altered or manufactured or being supplemented from outside the normal intelligence networks by intelligence from think tanks here in Washington. For example, the American Enterprise Institute fed a lot of bogus information, a lot of think tanks and nonprofit organizations that are connected to the Israeli government. So this is where it was coming from, and now we know it was all most of this information was bogus.
These think tanks, where is it? Are they really affecting the public, or are they more about affecting instead of public opinion, the politicians?
Well, it's all of those things. We now know that the American Enterprise Institute is continuing to feed information, policy to the White House on Iran. This is exactly what happened with Iraq. And you know, are they high-powered, the American Enterprise Institute? Well, one of their senior fellows is, they say fellow, but it's a chair over there, funded chair, as the wife of Vice President Cheney, Lynn Cheney. So yes, it's very high-powered. This is where John Bolton is now. This is where Paul Wolfowitz is now. These were the prime manufacturers of the plan to go to war with Iraq, and now we see them having still inordinate influence over this administration for what many believe is going to be military action against Iran.
And now, Richard, you have with your institute, your think tank, is indicated that it has a high access to members of Congress and the Bush administration and influencing policy. Does the think tank also go to influence the polls or how people, the American public, perceive our policy? Or, I mean, how does your think tank?
We work with the grassroots across America to try to see what American citizens and voters wish to have the American government, principally the Congress, but also the White House and the State Department, how they wish to have the American government interact with nations of the Middle East. Mr. Madsen, in passing, brought up Israel. I want to dispel one current misconception that somehow the White House and the State Department went to war at the bidding of Israel, or that Israel was in favor of the attack upon Iraq. My sources tell me that quite the contrary. Israel warned America that it was a mistake to go into Iraq, and also that they might better look at Iran, which might pose the greater threat. Coming to the present, because I didn't address Iran, but I would say that today there is a great deal of evidence right in the public media and the clear public statements of the President of Iran, President Ahmadinejad, that he intends not only to develop nuclear weapons, but he is proceeding ahead. And he said that whereas the discussion of the Holocaust and whether it occurred it should be open to research, but that his nuclear program should be closed to any further inquiry, and that should be a closed subject. So he is developing nuclear weapons, and on the other hand, he is threatening to eliminate Israel and the Jewish people, and there have been repeated statements which constitute.
Well, I wanted to go ahead and just put
these constitute violations of the UN Charter and the Genocide Convention, and the World Court is not addressing these issues.
I'd like to get into that for
Surely,
especially the second half.
Yes.
I really want to deal with that, but with the polling and the impact of the lobby group that you work with, that we also have. It says here that we believe a restored Israel is the fulfillment of prophecy. So, I mean, is that
that's
part
a good
of where
point.
you're...
Yes, of course. There is a.
It's the biblical reasons,
yes,
and that's why.
It's partly biblical,
because you said it's grassroots that drives what you do in Congress. But
yes, and there's a poll that you don't have here, which was the Pew Research poll on the influence of religion on American policy, which indicated that more than 42% of the American public believe that Israel was given to the Jewish people by God as stated in the Bible, and more than
I think Brian wants to interject
and wait a second,
on that
and
point.
more than
let you go on.
And more than one.
Brian go on.
Yes,
Brian,
and more than 1/3 of the American public believe that this very Israel is a fulfillment of the prophecies of the Old Testament.
Now, whether
Armageddon, not to bring on Armageddon, but whether or not you believe in the fulfillment of Bible prophecy,
go ahead, Brian.
I believe that it's a question of Israel sharing our democratic and free values, the only nation so sharing those values in the Middle East, and it's a big binding of America and Israel.
Let Brian
Mr. Hellman is a well-paid operative and a spokesperson for the Israeli war machine, and he's been as such for quite a while. Of course,
that's untrue. I am not paid by Israel, and I'm not well paid.
I didn't pay you. You're not paid by Israel, but you're a paid operative.
I am not a paid operative.
But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Hellman also should acknowledge that the Bible didn't give Israel the right to nuclear weapons, but indeed it has nuclear weapons, just as the United States has nuclear weapons, and that the United States and Israel are threatening the other peoples in the region. I don't believe that the U.S. went to war against Iraq. And it is a war against Iraq because the Israeli government or the so-called Israeli lobby dictated U.S. policy. I think that the neoconservatives had their own imperial ambitions, which is to dominate not only Iraq and its vast oil resources, but the entire region, including Iran and countries that were formerly colonized or semi-colonized parts of that oil-rich region. The fact of the matter is that the U.S. government went to war against Iraq, thinking that they could not only bring down the regime, but that they could refashion a new sort of Pax Americana in the Middle East. And
Could you describe Pax Americana?
Pax Americana would mean the U.S. would be sort of informally replacing the British Empire. The British at least acknowledged that they had an empire, that the sun never